Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. What does it take to go from engineering grad to marketing executive to managing director of a tech company you were never meant to lead? This week on Extrology, I sit down with Rupert Bedell, a marketeer by profession whose CV includes having been president of marketing for Europe at AmEx, a marketing director at NatWest, and now managing director of Fasthosts. We sit down for a raw, intelligent, and human conversation about reinvention, leadership, and what it really means to evolve at the highest level. We get into everything, from what Rupert wasn't ready for when he stepped into the CEO role, to how he balances pressure with purpose, and why the illusion of certainty is the enemy of growth. If you're serious about building a meaningful career, leading with integrity, or making the leap you've been afraid to make, this episode will change how you think. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Rupert Bedell, welcome to Extrology. Great to be with you here today as your guest, but great to have you on the show. And without further ado, customarily, as they say, let's dive in. I'm fascinated to see what I envisage as a career built on reinvention. What's one moment in your journey that no one sees on your LinkedIn but changed everything?
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, honestly, this might sound a bit corny, but 30th of September 2006, I got married, and that's not on my LinkedIn profile. And yet that's the person that honestly, the advice and guidance I get. I mean, there's always the obvious stuff, support. I've got 3 kids. She makes, working here possible by taking care of all of that. But her advice and her guidance, particularly in the tricky moments in my career, and there've been lots of those, that's the thing that I'm not particularly good at. I'm good at some other things. I'm not necessarily good at knowing what to say and do in difficult and challenging moments. She is absolutely brilliant at that. She has this innate ability to tell me to say the right thing. And her guidance has been, as I look back in all the kind of highs and lows and different things that have happened, she's been incredible.
That's an incredible answer. I'm 120 plus, maybe 130 episodes in, and no one has ever acknowledged the role and responsibility, and that's not through any malice, but never acknowledged the strength of character alongside them, perhaps respectfully in the background in some ways from a career perspective, but nonetheless a huge support to you and your endeavours. Yeah,
well, admittedly, I don't do it enough either, but she's got a big birthday this week. She will not thank me for saying which big birthday, so I definitely won't do that. So she's on my mind more than normal. But yeah, she, in those difficult moments, and we have those all the time, right? Yeah, just incredible advice. So whatever time I can get with her, she doesn't always have time to hear about my work stories, as most spouses probably don't. But she's just got an ability to know exactly the right thing to do or say, particularly at tricky times.
Do you know, I'm reminded of that phrase, do you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think it's testimony to the strength of the team that you have around you, not only from a board perspective, a leadership perspective, the whole organisation, but also importantly those that are in your own life that are providing that support as well to enable you to thrive in your chosen career.
Yeah, and listen, that kind of applies to your work colleagues as well so much. I think as I reflect back on my career, and there's been lots of changes, lots of different organisations and places that I've worked. Surrounding yourself with good people or being able to join an organization with good people, it's such a motivating factor. As you get out of bed in the morning, the people that you're going to work with and work for, really determine whether you're going to be successful in a place or not, or whether you're going to be happy in a place, more than the work that you're doing, more than what you achieve. So it's such an incredibly important thing for me, but I think for most people. And the further on I get in my career, that becomes more important, that decision point of, do I feel like I really want to go to work with these guys? Because if it's not there, it ain't going to work.
Well, I think the thing that fascinates me about that is if you think logically, arguably we spend more time with those with whom we work, most of us, than actually those that we've chosen to spend our lives with. So when we're not asleep, we're invariably in a place of work. For most people, that's common. And so therefore we're surrounded by people to then be in an environment that you're unhappy with or you're uncomfortable with, or that you're not enjoying, is deeply, deeply stressful and upsetting for a lot of people. And I think if you're in a position to make that change, or to elect to work in an environment where you feel utterly charged by the people that you're working with, then that's got to be a good place, right?
Yeah, 100%. And actually, at times, I think in my career, again, we all look back and think what you might have done differently. I think having the courage to sometimes think, I'm not happy here, and do something about it and step up and leave. When I was very young, people have asked me before, what's the your shortest job or the worst job?
I suppose exactly my next question. Seamless, beautifully done.
I'll go there already.
Dunkin' Donuts.
Yes. Donut gate. Yeah. When I was, I think it must have been about 19 or 20. Yeah, I spent 45 minutes working in Dunkin' Donuts, which I'm not particularly proud of. Why did I leave? 98% immature teenager, just not prepared to kind of see the job through, and I didn't really fancy it. I seem to remember there being some sort of promise or rumor that I'd get free deli sandwiches, and I was quite keen on those at the time. And when I arrived for work, I asked the manageress when I would get my sandwich break and the free sandwich, and she said, "No, you're not. I don't know who told you that. You're not getting that." And that weighed heavily on my mind for those 44 minutes before I made the decision to exit. But the point I was about to make. So when you're 19 and you're working in Dunkin' Donuts, it's not such a big deal if you do exit. There are times later on in my career, more serious jobs, that actually I was unhappy, and I wasn't happy with the people that I was working with, or I was working in a very bad environment and it was toxic and it was negative. But I didn't leave because you had the sense that, what doesn't kill me will make me stronger. I need to see this through. I can't be a quitter. I should have quit in some of those circumstances. I should have had, the strength to say, I'm not happy, and I'm not running away from hard work. And I would never advocate that. If you're leaving something, don't leave because it looks like it's going to be hard work. Leave if you're unhappy. Absolutely. And I would give the same advice to my kids now as they go into things. And it doesn't matter whether you're working in Dunkin' Donuts or you're, I don't know, on a route to be a partner at KPMG. If you're really not happy and you can't see a way out of it, don't stick with it for the sake of sticking with it. And I did that a few times, and actually those were kind of wasted times when I look back. I would have been better off saying, this isn't working out. I need to up and out.
It's hard though. I can sense that perhaps might not have felt this at the time, but at 19, you've very little to lose in reality. Whereas when you're, 35 and you're working your way through whatever your chosen career path might be, but you're working your way through the ladder that is relevant to you, there is that sense, well, if I step off here, what will people think? How will I be judged? How will it reflect on my future career choices? How will it impact? I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got mouths to feed, whatever, rent to pay, bills to meet, whatever. There are lots of things that can allow you to step back and go, I can't do this. I'm just going to have to suck it up and deal with it. What gave you the courage, do you think, to make the leaps that you've made when you've been needing to make them?
I mean, being totally candid, some of them weren't my choice. I faced redundancy in different jobs more than once, which I kind of think particularly, sort of part and parcel of careers these days, and particularly in marketing, if I'm honest. If you're a CMO, I think that's a position that's always under scrutiny. If you have a different CEO come in with a different idea, and particularly if you're a disruptive CMO, which I was a lot of times, you paint yourself into a corner a little bit. And if you've got a change of leader, they might not necessarily see the world the way that you do. So in that circumstance, you're out, and you got to pick yourself up again and go again. But with the right attitude, it does work out. And I think that's why I think back to those times when I was unhappy, I did stick with it for those reasons that you pointed out, fear of how might this look, or, your pressures and so on. And yet it's generally okay, right? If you've got the right attitude and you think, well, I'm leaving for a reason, but here's where I want to take my next step, and you remain positive and you remain energized and you're ready to throw yourself in, and you're not afraid of hard work. That is such an important thing. If you're looking for an easy life, then it's probably not going to work out great. But things generally do. If you keep that attitude and you keep that momentum and energy, you will end up in a better place. And look, what price being unhappy in a job? If there's no immediate change coming, and it's going to be like that for the foreseeable future, you've got to make that change.
Yeah, I think it's to own it, to encourage people to own it and take responsibility, which I appreciate is a very easy thing for me to sit here and say, and arguably very difficult for some people to do. But nonetheless, if you can own it, because in reality, to your point around facing redundancy, what is job security? We have this perception of security and certainty versus uncertainty of life. We have this perception of job security, which is arguably sadly perhaps, but no longer a feature of the working landscape for most people. So I think the thing that strikes me, you mentioned being a disruptive CMO, I think was the phrase that you used. The thing that struck me about some of the career choices that you've made is that you've made bold steps into industries where perhaps, respectfully, you might not have fitted the mold in the traditional sense. You've made leaps into differing industries very successfully. What gave you the courage to trust yourself in rooms where you weren't the expected voice, if I could use that phrase?
I think this came from one of the early moves in my career. I'd been at Barclays for 11 years. After that, I went to HSBC. I was there 2.5 years. And those are quite similar organizations, right? So big, fairly safe organizations to be in. My roles there were quite strategic looking back. But that was the ecosphere I was in, and that's where I expected to kind of spend most of my career. I got approached from a company I'd never heard of as a proper head of marketing role, as kind of CMO role. And it was in a currency exchange, a company called MoneyCorp that used to operate out of the airports and around the West End in London. And I'd never heard of them. And I immediately dismissed it out of hand thinking, why would I leave HSBC to go and work in this place? You know, it's this huge risk. And yet they came back and they were quite keen, and we went through the rounds of interviews. And the more I kind of looked into it, the more excited I got, and the more I could see the opportunity of taking control of the brand and the direction it needed to move in. And actually what I realized is I had all the kind of theory learned quite well through my career to date, but I'd had very little chance to put it into practice. And so I took that leap then, and a few people said, I think you're mad because you're not going to get a pension, and you probably won't get a bonus, and you might get made redundant, and you know, you're joining a small company here. But it was absolutely brilliant. It was like the lights went on when I moved into that role. I was properly leading for the first time. I was hyperactive in terms of the changes that needed to happen. And they were all the right things. We rebranded the company. We pitched for new retail estates. We grew that by 300%. Really moved marketing on. And I learned so much. Now, it lasted 18 months because, lo and behold, company got bought, new CEO, so on. I had very much disrupted and backed myself into a corner in terms of what I felt was the right next step. And that wasn't necessarily the vision that the incoming new CEO had. And then that was the first time I was ultimately out. Was it the wrong thing to do? Because I could have been still in HSBC in a very comfortable package, comfortable job. Absolutely the right thing to do, because I learned so much. And I learned the value of moving and going into an organization, how that energized me with this challenge in front of me. So since then, I mean, it's always a nervous thing when you go in, and particularly coming to Fasthosts, that was an absolute leap into something completely different type of role, different industry, different place. But I think, you know, going back to those early moves, you sort of develop some belief in your own perspective and your own experiences and how valuable they can be, and how actually coming into a place, you can be a breath of fresh air, or you can be a new lens on something. So I think I've had that in the back of mind, that's valuable, right? What I've learned along the way is that you need to keep a good dose of humility and patience when you come in. And I think that I didn't have that in those early years when I'd go into a new organization. I'd be in a massive rush to make changes straight away, to look good, to make my mark, to make an impact. And some people react brilliantly to that around you, and some people don't. And it's the ones that don't and don't say anything, but actually probably look at you from a distance and think, well, who does this guy think he is coming in and telling us how it should be done? They're the ones that you need to pay attention to. And I didn't really understand that when I was 30 years old. Probably understand it a bit more now, but I'm still learning.
What do you learn? I guess, what do you add to your skill set as a consequence of that MoneyCorp experience? But the thing that strikes me as a marketeer, and I'm absolutely accepting of the fact that marketing is not easy, but if you're HSBC or Barclays, people know who you are, right? Then we might want to understand more, but you don't have that challenge around, you know, the name is going to get you in the door. Not in every door, but it'll get you in the door. I have a preconceived notion as to how I perceive those brands and what they might be able to offer me. You then go to a respectfully relatively unknown name, and it's your job to turn that unknown name into a name. What do you learn? What do you add to your skill set? What do you learn from the experience, do you think?
You know, I would always advocate to people, particularly at the early stage of their career, take the opportunity to work in large organizations and small organizations if you can, because they're so different and they require different skills. There's different pressures. I think if you can combine both, and if somebody was coming to interview for a head of marketing role here today, you know, that's something I would look at and value very highly, because not only do they have the theory of how to do it well in places like Barclays, they can execute because they have to in a small organization. There is no hiding place. I would be more skeptical if somebody has spent their entire career in, I don't know, Visa, because you can kind of get away with doing very little. You might be very smart, but that delivery pressure isn't necessarily there. And that's no reflection on Visa. I've never worked at Visa, but, you know, big organizations generally. So I think being able to combine that experience, I learned so much in that 18 months at MoneyCorp and subsequently in other small organizations I worked in, at Unum, at Paysend. because there was that pressure and you had to deliver. What I think I learned along the way was a bit more patience. You don't have to get it all done in the first 6 months. And actually, you make mistakes if you try and do that, both in terms of what you execute, but also building relationships. Not everybody's ready to go that fast, and they're not all bought in the journey. And it's usually the ones that aren't speaking that you've got to pay attention to. So look, I think the combination of experience is really good. And marketing is evolving, right? The marketing I was doing 15 years ago bears no resemblance to what marketeers have to deal with today. It's much more integrated in MarTech. It's much more commercial. You need a lot more financial understanding. It's less creative, to be honest, and that is a sad thing. I think we've lost a little bit along the way in this jump to performance marketing. But you've got to be developing your skills and learning all the way to try and keep pace with that. And that's why I think different experiences, different industries, different organizations, that those are the really important things as people build their skill set and their careers.
Do you think what part data has played in that? Demise is too strong a word, but that sort of less focus on become less creative, I think was the phrase that you use. Is that because we become so myopically focused on granular levels of detail from a data perspective to inform decisions that it almost takes a little bit of the perceived risk around taking a creative punt on something? Is that a fair? Yeah. I've probably butchered the industry, your profession by definition.
Not at all. That's exactly it. Right. So look, ROI has become everything for marketers. And, pretty much any organization you go into now, you're dealing with CFO, with budget, with CEO, with board. And therefore, anything you want to do, you've got to be able to tie it back to dollars invested, dollars received. That doesn't really support brand marketing. That supports putting everything into Google paid search and tracking absolutely everything that comes out the back of it. Now, where does that lead you? Well, less big, above the line, risky campaigns. You don't see so many of those anymore. When I look at the brands that win the Cannes Awards these days, I don't think the creativity is anywhere near where it was 20 years ago. The leading creative agencies, I don't think are churning out the same work because they're not allowed to do so. They're not getting the briefs from big clients to say, you know what, we're going to take a punt for 2 years on rebuilding our brand. And actually, we're not going to worry about the ROI for now because this is a brand building exercise. I just don't believe those conversations are happening anymore. I think, by and large, organizations have probably spending less than they were. They don't take, big sponsorship punts anymore. The Premiership doesn't have a headline sponsor or hasn't had for years and years. Back in the day, we just went for it. And there was no calculation on whether this thing was ever going to pay back. And if there was, it was a load of nonsense because you invest in the brand and you can see the opportunities and then creative people can see how they can turn this and make it magical and make the brand look fantastic. So there's it's just that risk appetite isn't there anymore. And as a result, brands have got less creative over time. But I do think these things come in cycles. I think the pendulum's gone right over towards performance marketing. I do think it'll come back a little bit, not quite the same way. The world has changed. But my advice to organizations now, marketers making their way, trying to make their mark is lean into that, right? You got to lean into the place where others aren't showing up, and really creative, original ads, ideas, campaigns, angles of attack are what's going to make you stand out.
How much of it is? I heard a great expression the other day that, from a business perspective, this was a broad sweeping generalisation. It's never helpful, but nonetheless, we'll go with them. That we have a weight problem. W-A-I-T.
You're talking about me personally here.
No, very much W-A-I-T. In so much as patience, touching back on that subject, and the accusation was levelled that almost the introduction of quarterly reporting has condensed the focus around what is it that you're doing today to drive today's outcome, or even in terms of forward visibility, maybe this quarter, versus a Chinese kind of influence, Asian influence of what does this look like for our grandchildren. So they're thinking in dynasties, we're thinking in quarters. And actually, so the longer term perspective in Western business culture has been lost. And that probably the sensible argument would be, well, we'd probably arrive somewhere between the two, right? So we've got that kind of focus on longevity and what this looks like for the future versus the need to make it impact and outcome today. And I wonder if that weight problem, we've gotten very, we're of a similar vintage. I'm old enough to remember the concept of a 5-year plan. It's not quite irrelevant now, but it's almost unheard of now. Maybe you've got 12 months, 3 years, possibly. 5 years, certainly not a 10-year plan, which once upon a time was certainly in evidence when I first started out in first kind of proper job. So do you think that's fair, that the expectation has been shortened and that we do have a patience problem?
Yeah, look, I think that's really accurate. we used to talk about being too short-termist because everything was, 5 and 3 years. Now, I mean, we have a new yearly plan, but honestly, the numbers at the end of the year, we rarely think about. We think about what's, this quarter or even this month. And actually that's the way we're operating in this organization, very much going month to month about, what we can change, what we can get out the door, how we increase customer inflow, slow down outflow, but they're short-term tactics. And the reality is, things are moving so fast, organizations disappear very quickly that you can't really make plans in the old way of, the 5-year plan and what we think we're going to evolve into. It's who knows what the world will be like in 5 years. Every day I wake up, there's a different headline. Donald Trump's done something complete. We're just in this hyper change, and it can be, a complete 180 from one day to the next. So look, I do think we are thinking very short term. I'm not sure there's any alternative at the moment. We're very fortunate here in Fasthosts. We're a very agile organization. We can get things moving super quick. We launched a campaign yesterday for businesses in Gloucester. We're giving away our web hosting services free for a year to businesses in Gloucester. We got that out the door in kind of 6-7 days from thinking about it. So that's fantastic. It works very well in the short term, but we're guilty as anybody of lack of long-term thinking.
I do think it's interesting. I suspect this period of history will be studied in much the same way that we might have studied the Industrial Revolution when we were kids. When we're living through this technological, and it is a revolution. I think, as I say, it comes back to my own age, but my first proper job, I didn't have a PC on my desk. I had a fixed line phone and a Rolodex, and a Filofax to keep my appointments in. That the way the world has changed in just 30 years is stunning to behold. And yet I suspect when we're living through it, it just becomes the way we do things. With the benefit of hindsight, 100 years out, our great-grandchildren, whoever they may be, when they're studying this period, it's like, what a technological revolution that was, and the pace and dynamism of it. I mean, here we are today with the onset of AI becoming ever more evident. And I just think as to the changes that then brings and what this next phase of 5-10 years will look like, it's it's phenomenal. It's a great time to be alive, but it's also scary because of the pace of change, right?
Yeah. And it brings stresses, right? Trying to keep up with that change and, bringing it back to, I suppose, kind of marketing lens. That's why I think that function has been so challenging for people in the last 10, 15 years, because MarTech has progressed at an incredible pace. And it's so hard to remain the expert in a particular area of marketing because it's all changing so quickly. I was asked to speak a year or two ago about the life cycle of a CMO. And I looked into, how long a typical CMO lasts, and it was less than a Premiership football manager. So it was typically less than 18 months. Again, because you're accountable for so much in an organization. You're accountable for being the creative influence. You're accountable for the voice of the customer. You're accountable for MarTech more than the CTO necessarily is. You're obviously accountable for ROI, for the numbers, for understanding the market dynamics, pricing in a lot of cases. It's an awful lot. And it's a super pressured job to begin with. But then all those things are moving at once. And it's very easy to fail. So, when I talk to people in marketing now, one of the things I say is, if you haven't failed already, get ready for it, because it'll come at some point in your career, unless you're absolutely hiding in an organization. If you've got any accountability whatsoever, get ready for the day you fail and be ready to pick yourself up and go again. Because I just think it's a challenging industry to be in.
I see you as a fixer in broken systems in many ways. What's something you've had to fix in yourself to become the leader that you are now?
I think patience. That's something I mentioned earlier on. I probably didn't really have that sort of early on in my career. I was very motivated on being a disruptor and doing things differently and innovating and bringing change, and that's all great. But you can try and go too fast in places, and the realization you don't have to get it all done in the first 6 months, and actually sitting and waiting and allowing people to come on the journey with you, and also seeing how things play out. I'm very intuitive. I don't really like doing loads of research. I don't really like spending hours and hours in the data. Sometimes I got a feel for what's right and wrong, and I want to move quickly. And again, others sometimes react very well to that. They like an intuitive leader to come in and say, well, you know what? Let's not spend 6 months worrying about this. This feels like the right way to go. Let's move forward and test if we need to, but absolutely let's move forward. It doesn't necessarily convince everybody in the room. And I think that's one of the things I've learned over time. You have to be a little bit more nuanced in terms of how you influence people. And patience is really important. I'm naturally impatient anyway. So I think by applying that, that's fixing something that's broken in me, I think. The other one would be just, learning from people around me and making sure I listen. I mentioned my wife earlier on, who's a fantastic counsel. There are others in companies where, again, if I'd taken the time to go and listen to the detractors early on, I think I'd have got more than I thought. Whereas sometimes I would come into an organization, shout my mouth off straight away about what I thought was right and wrong. Some people would go quiet and I'd think, they're just not really on it. Let's just don't let them hold me up. What I needed to do was go and listen to them, because they had very valid concerns at that point, which would have helped.
How much of that do you think that evolution in your own style and is a function of your own experience, your age as you're evolving? I reflect on my own experiences and think, crikey, I was so impatient. I was in such a rush in my 20s, and I genuinely thought, I've got to get this done. I've got no time, Whereas I look back now and I think I still feel like I've got all the time in the world, and actually that window is closing. But I just feel like I've maybe smelling the roses is a little bit of wisdom. I wouldn't say I've got a lot, but I do feel that as I've gotten older, I am a little bit more naturally, a little bit more patient. And I don't know if that's just the way it is, or just because of experience has led me that way.
Yeah, honestly, I think experience is the best educator, and certainly, most of my learning points have come from getting it wrong, and I continue to get it wrong every day in little ways and sometimes big ways. And I think we all do. But yeah, I rely very much on a kind of informal mentor network. I wouldn't call any of them formal mentors, but people I've kept in touch with that I really value in terms of their leadership. That helps me enormously. You get an awful lot of great advice at times from people, but there's no substitute for learning through your own mistakes, making sure you reflect on them. I'm becoming more of a reflector in my old age. There's more to reflect on. I didn't have a lot to reflect on when I was 22, apart from Dunkin' Donuts. So, taking a moment, particularly, if you're unfortunate enough to be moved out of a job against your own will, the one good thing you get from that is time to reflect. And so, at times in my career, I've been able to look back and think, well, okay, that one ended well or didn't end well, but it is what it is. What could I have done differently? Often not that much. Sometimes I think when you are exited from an organization, it's rarely anything that you could have done differently. It was just written in the stars. But what did I learn? You've always got quite a lot to reflect on there. And sometimes it comes to you in the middle of the night. Sometimes you're swimming in the sea. It's strange moments when you have this little, yeah, actually, that's the thing I need to take away from that job. So I always try and make sure that there's reflection time and you do collect those things and don't forget them.
What's a belief about leadership that you used to hold that perhaps you've now flipped?
I think the importance of communication, it just sounds like such an obvious thing to say, and yet I don't believe that many leaders do it enough and do it well enough. I'd say that the three most important things in this job: communication, not just regular communication, but actually telling people everything. Now, I've observed a lot of leaders in different organizations where, there's a propensity to hold back. We've got this issue. We need to make sure that this remains within the room. We don't want to tell, the workforce about this, or, just that can never, this sort of stuff can never be broadcast. And sometimes it's not treating people as adults. This is something I believe in much more now. I didn't necessarily understand earlier on, that actually giving people the whole picture and trusting them to make the decisions is incredibly important. And so one of the things we really focus on heavily here in Fasthosts is just communicating how we're doing at every stage of the journey. So around the building, you see screens that are actually showing exactly how many customers we won last month and how many we lost, exactly what customers say about us on Trustpilot, good and bad, exactly what our NPS scores are, even if they're all in the red, so on and so on and so on. It means if I meet somebody in the corridor, they already know exactly how we're doing. There's no need. Nobody's in the dark. We win together and we lose together. And look, that's just one communication channel. It goes as far as all the regular all hands meetings, just giving people the information, all the information at all times. I think people value that, and they recognize that you are treating them as an adult. You trust them. They're your employees, right? And generally they make good decisions. And so that's something I think that I didn't necessarily disagree with earlier on in my career, but I was probably wired that way from leaders that I'd seen. Whereas I've learned that actually that's an incredibly valuable thing to do.
And you move from, as I see, you move from brand builder to business builder is how I want to describe it. What weren't you ready for, and how did you catch up?
So this is an interesting one because from what I gathered, it's not an often made move from kind of CMO to sort of CEO type role or leader of the organization. And actually, I was chatting to somebody not that long ago who was like a VC, and they invested in companies, and they often made decisions to move somebody, put a new CEO in. And I said, yeah, I've just taken this job, and it's CEO position in this company. It's the head of the company. And he said, well, I thought you were a CMO. I said, well, I was up until this. And he couldn't believe that the company hadn't hired the CFO into that position. They said, well, we would always insist on the chief finance officer becoming the CEO. That's how it's done. And I said, okay, that's interesting, because I'm looking at the role, and I'm not particularly worried about the P&L ownership. I understand adding and subtracting. I understand revenue. I understand costs. I've been a budget owner. I understand how these things work. I understand what we've got to deliver against. So what else is there to learn? And the conversation, there wasn't a whole lot other than, well, we still feel like that, those are the right people to put in front of a board. Well, I've been in front of a board plenty of times as a CMO. Well, I'm not particularly uncomfortable with that. And then you flip the conversation. You say, well, what would a CMO bring to that role that a CFO wouldn't necessarily have, right? Understanding a brand strategy. That's a pretty important thing for a CEO to know about, to be able to inspire the organization around him. Strong communicator. Generally speaking, I would say a CMO's got that in his locker more than a CFO. Performance marketing and MarTech. Well, revenue is important. How are you going to drive revenue? It's marketing decisions. Do we put it into Google? Do we do an ad campaign? Where's the right place to do this? Again, you'll have all of that background as a CMO. Cost control. You're the biggest cost in the business if you're a CMO. You understand cost control. If you don't, you've been a very poor CMO. Voice of the customer. Again, CMO knows this inside out. These are critical things for a CEO. And on and on and on we go. Market dynamics, pricing of competitors. You've got all of that in your locker. So I'm really passionate about this. I don't understand why more CMOs aren't coming through to be organization leaders, because they've got all the stuff that you don't have in other C-suite roles. What they don't have is P&L ownership. And it's not rocket science, right? I don't think so. So maybe others will disagree, but that's my view.
Out of interest, what was the VC's response to your point? Because I think you make a really, if you think of the VC model, ultimately a return on that investment is what's driving, is their motive. And arguably all the things you've just evidenced would elicit, clearly nothing's ever guaranteed in life, but you'd arguably elicit a significant uptick on their initial investment in a way that respectfully all of those things, yes, okay, your CFO is going to know what levers to pull to maximize profitability, but you're talking about growing revenues, and that's ultimately what needs to happen, and brand and all those other good things, which then primes you for a sale, right? So I would argue you've just... the pitch to the VC, I'd decide, where do I sign? So what was his response or her response?
Well, I think we were watching our kids play football in the park at the time. I think we went, all right, no need to get so touchy about it. I can't honestly remember, but I remember thinking I see that attitude all the time. Like, how can a CMO make this step? It should be a CFO or a different role, or CCO. And I just don't buy it. I just don't think I think that's very myopic thinking, if I'm being totally honest. And I think if you've got that breadth of experience as a CMO, I'm not saying everybody in marketing makes the best leader, but I do think they've got a lot in their kit bag if they've managed all this stuff and they've managed big budgets and they've managed big teams and they're able to lead and they're good communicators and they understand the market that they're in. Why not?
Certainly the way you just articulated and pitched your profession, absolutely. I think perhaps it's an aversion to perceived risk. And I'd emphasize on the perceived. It's a bit like what we were touching on earlier, and we'll come on to this, the transition you've made from industry perspectives. I think organizations get, again, myopically focused on, we're a widget manufacturer with 30 years widget manufacturing, and we need someone who can lead us who's got 30 years widget manufacturing. You start to unpick, well, your board's got 100 years of widget manufacturing experience on it. Why do you need your CEO to have it? Well, because we're a widget manufacturer. So I think organizations miss out because they have this kind of focused lens and assumption that, well, it's different here. What we do is different. Someone new wouldn't understand it. I think if you're leading businesses, that leadership capability and the range of transferable skills you've just described become hugely compelling for an organization, regardless of where you've picked up that experience.
Listen, obviously I agree with that.
Yeah.
I've just come into an industry 6-7 months ago that I mean, look, this is a hosting company. We do servers, we do cloud products, we do domains, we do, WordPress. You could write a book on what I don't know about any of that. And coming into the job, I knew absolute zero beyond my own research. And yet they were willing to take a punt on a guy who had worked in a completely different industry, but who did understand B2B marketing. And, I would certainly say that. So I'm very thankful that they had the vision to do that, because I agree. They didn't need another server expert in this organization. What I have done, and all the people in this building will advocate for this, is talk a lot about brand and talk a lot about pricing and talk a lot about angle of attack against our competitors and talk a lot about what we should be calling out that we haven't necessarily done so in the past. I talk a lot about trying to energize the people here. When I came in, it honestly felt a little flat in terms of the people engagement. We had our normal annual survey where you measure colleague engagement, positive sentiment. It was incredibly low. It was an unacceptably low number. Now, look, there was reasons for that. They just went through a restructure last year. They moved some of the jobs and functions out to the parent company. People felt very worried about that. A lot of colleagues had left. The previous CEO, who'd been in the organization 16, 17 years, had already said he intended to leave and it was time to move on. And again, that makes everybody feel a little flat. And so I knew that there was a job to do there, which had nothing to do with servers. And it had everything to do with getting the energy back, the buzz back. It's helped hugely. We've moved to a new building. That is a massive improvement. But we've also done a lot of the softer stuff around. We've had more executives come from the parent company. We've had 3 in the last 2 weeks come and visit, talk about their vision. That was really important. We've set up social clubs. We've got the video club. We've got the board games club. We've got a bake-off competition. All of those little things that people, maybe did pre-pandemic, but just got lost when we all went home and sort of came back in dribs and drabs. Just getting that back, you sort of feel that tide begin to turn and people become energized again in their work. So again, you don't need a server expert to come and do that. You need somebody who's led teams and will recognize that a company's in a down moment and you need to energize it and bring it back up again. And again, you're a CMO, often extrovert, you're a communicator, you're comfortable doing that. That's a skill set that often goes with that role.
So it leads me into one of the questions that I had around what you're building here, and not just as a business, but as a culture. What are you building here? What are you building at Fasthosts?
So I would say, look, success can be defined in many ways. Results obviously will be at the forefront of our minds. I think culturally, there's definitely an opportunity to be a more open, accessible, helpful, supportive business that is part of its local business community, but also plugs into other communities. I think for a while now in the past, we have, the organization has focused on strong products, good customer offering, excellent service. I have to say the service offering in this company is incredible. But what we haven't done is kind of come out of our box and engaged with the community around us. And that's something that I'm very keen that we do. So we've just hired someone to lead our outreach program. And they're now spending time in the local colleges, the local universities, speaking to students, understanding how they might use our products or what they think of the hosting industry. We're inviting them into this building to experience a day working in a technology company. They might want to come and work here one day. That might lead to internships and sponsored programs, all of which will be good for us. For the first time ever, we're having face-to-face customer focus groups. So we're inviting groups of customers that live in the region to come in, have a glass of wine, some food, and come and sit in this room and talk to us about their experience, what they like and what they don't like, and just to interact more with them. We're doing a lot more PR. So I'm out talking to journalists. I'm doing podcasts like we are today, really to try and talk about the organization, talk about the things that we're doing positive, but also to listen and learn about the business community around us. A little bit of this for me comes from, if we go back, 15 years, and it's actually to do with the England football team. And if you remember back in, I don't know if you're a football fan, but back in 2010, I think Fabio Capello was the manager. And it was the embodiment of a closed team. They went down to South Africa for the World Cup and they stayed in this camp behind barbed wire. Journalist time was absolutely minimal. They didn't want to give anything away. It was really guarded. And so journalists, it didn't take a lot for the media to kind of turn on the team when things started to go badly because they've been given no access. It was a completely closed system. And it all failed and Capello was a bad guy and so on and so on. And I remember thinking at the time, this is a PR problem with England. They always feel like they've got the media on their back and they play with the weight of the world on their shoulders. And yet they're an incredibly talented team. They always underperform. What they need is to open up. They need a PR policy that says, right, we're going to build relationships with journalists. We're going to go to local schools and help kids and actually film it and be much more open and human with the press. And of course, Gareth Southgate comes in and does exactly that. First move, opens it up and says, right, this is the type of organization we're going to be. So I'm using that as a story because that's a little bit, in a much smaller way, how we're thinking about Fasthosts is open it up. Open up this building as a digital hub for Gloucester. That's what we want. We want organizations, local businesses, chambers of commerce, local government, podcast recorders, everybody to come and use this space and come and work with us because we think that that's a positive thing for Fasthosts. It's certainly good for us in terms of our profile, but we're going to learn a lot about our customers, about our business community, about other people that can help us. So it's much more open. It's much more accessible. It's much more collaborative. It takes a lot of time and energy, but I think it's, this is maybe us playing the long game a little bit here, which, back to my point, companies don't often do.
So what would you want the people who work with you to feel long after you've left the building?
I'd like them to feel that they made a positive impact on their colleagues. This is something that's very important to me. I can't remember when I first heard this, but somebody said, it's not about what you deliver in life. It's about the relationships you build, and it's about the impact you have on other people. When you get to the end and you're sort of looking back on the things that you did well, I'm not sure I'm going to reflect on, that product launch or, beating our revenue target by X in that year. What I think I'll reflect on is I made a bit of a difference in that place. Actually, I made it feel better to go and work there. The things that I did, the energy I brought, the banter, in the team, that made a positive impact on my colleagues. And sometimes that's what I say to people, when I'm trying to get them to put their hand up for the social club is, we think a lot about what we've got to deliver. Don't forget the impact you have on your colleagues when you come in. You make their lives a little bit brighter by, what you bring, organizing the cake competition, having a chat, having a laugh, going out for a drink, just taking a little bit of an extra step to organize something, which makes everybody feel better about coming to work. And then they bring their A game to work. They come and do 100%, 110%. The cumulative effect of that is really important. So I would like people to think that they did make a positive impact, that actually it was worthwhile and that they enjoyed their work and they achieved something for sure, but they made a positive impact on the people around them.
I'm fascinated to dig a bit deeper into that, Rupert. What drives you? Because the thing that strikes me is that radical transparency and you've got a tremendous amount of energy and a very positive message to impart. But the job of the CEO, sometimes you have to deliver difficult messages. That comes with the territory. What gets you out of bed in the morning? What motivates you? What inspires you? Where does this positivity come from?
I think, and it might be one of the reasons why I've moved around so much in my career, I'm absolutely motivated by a big challenge, a clear challenge, a different challenge. I found times when I've moved, back to that example I was talking about earlier on when I went from HSBC to Moneycorp, different challenge, a lot of pressure, but my goodness, I enjoyed the challenge that was in front of me. So, having a fresh, difficult challenge, I really like. And having to sit and break it down and do it in chunks, I really do enjoy that. And I'm enjoying it more and more as I kind of get older and a bit more experienced. The worry is what happens when it's not a challenge or it's not fresh anymore. And I do worry about that, the 18-month itch when you've been at an organization, you've done a lot of the things that you came in to do. And that's part of the reason why I have to kind of remind myself to slow down a bit and not try and get it all done immediately. But yeah, that's what drives me. And particularly you go into a place where things are not necessarily working right, and I'd say that the colleague engagement was the first thing I picked up on here is like, okay, I've got a job to do there. I've got a new building on the horizon. That's a fantastic opportunity. I need to lean into that and really make that happen. The other time in my career that I'm reminded of that was when I went to RBS in 2012. And RBS at that point was the poster boy for the first financial crash. Everything had gone wrong, the kind of Fred Goodwin stuff. So the brand was absolutely toxic, and small businesses particularly. And my job was small business marketing. And internally, they really wanted to kind of make the brand great again. And there was talk of TV advertising. And at the time, I was like, whatever we do, we're going to get shot to pieces on it. I can just 5 seconds on social media will tell me that. You really want to go and spend £30 million on a TV ad saying how great RBS is for business when every newspaper in the land is saying how bad we are. But it was something I had to fix. And so I love the challenge. I was kind of going into that job thinking, I'm back in the banks because I went from Moneycorp into RBS. And I thought, I'm going back to a big company. It's going to be a bit slow again and it's going to be a bit frustrating. Yet by the time I got my head around that challenge, I was all over it. And we did exactly that. We went out with a kind of three TV campaigns instead of one. They were all built on songs and lyrics that actually were just doing good things for customers, which were above any kind of criticism. They weren't making money for the man. They were just giving stuff back to local business. And that was a good thing.
So how do you define success now? And how different is that from what you thought it was 10 years ago?
10 years ago, I'd have said, right, strong customer scores, revenue target, there's kind of traditional things that you're held to account for. I think I've got a bit more of a nuanced view now about colleague happiness. It sounds a bit happy clappy when I talk about it like that, but it's, how people feel coming to work. I spend a lot of my time working on programs like that, which aren't going to be considered in, my bonus calculation. It's going to be back to the hard numbers. And yet I think that is success. If you can leave an organization in a much better space than you entered it in terms of how people feel working for that company, I think that's absolutely worth going after. And I get a lot of happiness and satisfaction from moving the dial on that.
So what's one leadership habit you swear by that others overlook?
I think for me, it's having the courage to treat people like adults, to give them accountability, to trust them, to give them all the information, in a town hall, tell them how it is, not be too guarded about the message. I've seen that far too many times just be value destroying when leaders operate in that way. And so many do. I'm a much more open in my communication style. Probably tell people too much at times, and that's got me in trouble as well. But I generally err on that side, and I would say on balance, that's been a positive thing. So, look, 99 times out of 100 people make the right decisions when you give them the autonomy to do so. And yet, so many leaders are very guarded about allowing people to do stuff and have permission and sign-offs and all this sort of stuff. So I'm generally quite empowering, and just treat people like adults. They appreciate it.
So what scares you about where leadership is heading, and what gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the kind of world today just scares me a lot, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And that's everything from the pace of AI and the impact that's having on jobs. I've obviously spent most of my career in marketing. A lot of my former colleagues are out of work. You look at LinkedIn, and some of this is AI impact, right? Copywriters, this type of thing. Many jobs. Companies are switching to AI to do that. So I think I worry a little bit about the world that my kids will operate in. My world of work, I think, is fairly well defined. I've probably got about another 15 years left in me. Hopefully it's a good 15 years. But as my kids, my eldest is 14 now, that their work experience is on the horizon. I have no idea of the world that they're going to operate in. And, working from home, that's, are they going to work from home 5 days a week and never interact? And actually, I had this conversation with my 14-year-old the other day. And he went, yeah, that'd be fine. I was like, what? You would be happy sitting in your pajamas for 35 years? Yeah, I'd rather that than go to work. I'm like, good almighty, how the world has changed. So that fills me with horror. This environment is not necessarily a leadership worry, but just how it's going to be. I heard a stat the other day about the last nightclub in Britain closing in 2029 at current rates of closure. And I thought, God, the world without nightclubs, what are they going to do in their 20s? And yet, they don't go to nightclubs anymore. They go to the gym and they go on social media. That terrifies me. What kind of existence is that? So I know I sound like an old fart when I talk like this, but these things worry me.
No, not at all. I had a conversation downstairs before we got into this discussion here today with a couple of people that work here, and we were talking about being inherently social creatures and the value of coming back to the workplace and the flexibility that you afford employees here, but also the upside from being in an office environment and actually not only the social interaction, but also how that solves problems from a work perspective, from a customer perspective, all sorts of benefits to it. And I think it's perhaps different for the likes of you and I, where we've built networks as a consequence of our work experiences over a number of years. But if you're just getting started out, I think some of those relationships I formed in those first jobs that I had working alongside people, the learning that afforded me, the informal learning, not from the classroom or the training courses, but actually learning how to behave in the office environment, good and bad, both elements of that, learning what I liked and what I didn't like. I found that invaluable, and I don't know how I acquire that same expertise, whether it would even be needed in 15, 20 years' time, from working in my back bedroom on my laptop. That's the bit it doesn't quite compute with me, but I worry is that perhaps evidence of my age and my tenure, rather than, and the world would look very differently, in much the same way that I'm sure if I sat down and spoke with my father along similar lines, he'd say the same thing, that the world of work I entered was distinctly different from the world of work that he entered.
Completely agree. And I worry about that as well. The things I've learned along the way, I didn't learn on video calls. I learned from watching leaders personally deal with stuff or deal with stuff badly, and then you sort of learn how not to do it. But also just, relationships in my life. I met my wife through work when I was in my early 20s, and a lot of my friends as well on the Barclays graduate program. It was a fantastic experience. It was like kind of an extension of university, but, we were all on this adventure together. If you're at home 5 days a week, 4 days a week, I just don't know what kind of existence we would have had. Not a very happy one is my answer. So but equally, I talked to my dad. The first time I got made redundant, my dad was absolutely horrified. He thought that was the end for me because he was in the same company his whole life. And he said, "What have you done wrong?" I said, "Well, it wasn't really my fault. It's just the world changed. A new CEO came in, and I didn't really get on with him, but he was really worried, and I was too, to a point when until you kind of rebound, you think, this is how it happens. You just got to get your chin up, go again, and good things will happen."
Absolutely. What's What's one lesson you'd pass on? If you look at your experience, you've worked with SMEs, you've worked with large corporates, but is there one lesson you'd pass on to an SME founder, entrepreneur, or perhaps leader today who's building right now? What's the one lesson you'd share with them?
So I think for me, it goes back to the thing we were talking about a little while ago about being creative, because I think there's a dearth of it in industry today. And I think that's, having the courage to go and do something original and creative is what makes you stand out. And channels are primed to pick up on this. You see somebody doing something really original on social media, and suddenly they're a worldwide hit. So it's not like you have to go around banging on doors to tell people how creative you are. You spend a bit of time, doing something creative and different, and there it goes. It catches fire immediately. But so few organizations are doing that now. You see it in spots on social media. I think it was Curry's that have been doing some really cool kind of video ads. And then we all try and copy them. But, who cares? You're copying. So, the moment is lost. So, that would be my advice is don't get too hung up and don't spend 100% of your time worrying about performance metrics or, the bottom line. And look, I know those things are super important when you're running an SME. Don't forget to be creative. And look, it's not about being brave. It's just about taking the time to go and say, what can I do this month that's just out there? It's left field. It's totally different. Might catch fire, might not. But what have I lost in doing so? That would be my advice, because that's the thing. If you really want your business to catch fire, showing a bit of creative spark at a time when there's a lack of it, I think is it's a real opportunity.
Complete this sentence for me. Leadership without what is worthless?
Well, laughter, maybe. I love a leader who can laugh. I respond very well to that. It's probably not the answer that would resonate with everybody. I think the other answer I'd give is maybe learning. For me, at any stage in a job, we talked about leaving a job if you're unhappy. Leaving a job if you're not learning, right? I'm learning at the moment. I'm in a steep learning curve still in this role. I will be for a while to come. So I think you've always got to be aware that, nobody's a finished article. You no matter what position you're in, there's a lot to learn. So just make sure you're picking up on those points and you're mentally logging them and adjusting as you go. So yeah, learning is probably the smart answer. I like a leader who can have a laugh.
And last but not least, when you hear the words people, performance and purpose, which one are you living in most right now and why? Right
now, we're about purpose in this organization. I think that's the people bit, I think, is correcting. I feel like that's moving in the right direction. That's probably where I've been the last 6 months, if I'm honest. If he'd asked me 3 months ago, that was the answer. The performance, again, I think that's coming together. We're doing the right things. There's not an awful lot I'd change about that. I think our numbers, we're a bit up and down, but we're going to land in the right place. The purpose bit, I'm leaning into heavily right now. Our brand, what it means, what we stand for, all of that stuff about community outreach, bringing our customers in, reaching out to local business. One of the things I love about working here in Gloucester is I feel a sense of purpose here that I didn't have when I worked in Canary Wharf. You come here, this city has social and economic challenges, and yet we've got a part to play in that. We are an employer of 250 people here in the city centre. We've just moved into this fabulous digital forum building. Everybody's looking at us. We've got the attention. We've got an obligation to improve this place, and it's on a journey and it needs improvement. You walk around Gloucester city centre for half an hour, you'll see that very apparently. So we can do something about that if we act in the right way. And that's part of the reason why we're putting so much emphasis on this outreach program. So I think for me right now and for the coming months, it's all about purpose. And that won't necessarily help our bottom line directly, but I think it's the right thing to do at this moment in time.
Rupert Bedell, fantastic. Thank you for your candour, your insight and your energy this afternoon. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for inviting me into these wonderful offices. It's great. It's a great facility that you've got here. There's a great buzz about the place. That's certainly been my experience as I've been here today. So thank you for taking the time out to share your experiences with us and our listeners on Extrology. It's been great fun, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Likewise, really enjoyed it.
If this conversation resonated with you, do us and someone else a favour. Drop us a review wherever you're listening. It helps Extrology reach the people who need these conversations most. Make sure you follow the show, subscribe on YouTube, and if you want deeper insights from today's episodes, head over to Substack where we break it all down and give you the tools to apply it in your own life. And if you're serious about building a career that actually matters, check out The Career Edge, our premium content on Substack built for leaders, creatives, and high performers who want more than just advice. Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, and keep chasing performance with purpose. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.